Woo, what a view! Dimaya exclaimed. A gust of cool wind tossed Frian's golden locks as they stood atop the village's light tower. While the view of the vale was indeed breathtaking, she wasn't focused on the lake or the distant peaks to the east. How far is it to that strip of forest up the road to the northwest? Frian asked. 4 kilometers, Ludmilla answered. If you're wondering how much land each village manages, it's 25 square kilometers. Frian silently scanned the fields on the terraces around them. That's far too much. At least by the Empire's standards, it was. As far as she knew, Riastais was no different. Each farming village in the Empire managed about 10 square kilometers of fields and copses. The allocation was something like a hard rule, as it was determined by how far the villagers could walk and move equipment and still get a good day of work in. This is possible because of undead labor? Rangobart asked. That's right, Ludmilla answered. Speaking of which, I've spotted them. Let's go and take a look, shall we? They descended the tower and boarded their carriage, riding a kilometer southeast along the main road connecting the farming villages. The vehicle stopped on the shoulder of the road, but there were no undead to be seen. The team I spotted is 2 kilometers that way, Ludmilla pointed to a distant terrace further up the valley. Can everyone fly? Walking out there would take a wizard an hour. Does it take non-wizards less time? Dimaya frowned. It varies depending on vocation. For instance, a decent ranger could cover the same distance in 5 minutes if they run straight there. Through the mud? Mud doesn't matter to a ranger. Dimaya gave Ludmilla a dubious look. Are you a bad woman like Wagner? It's true, Rangobart said, then cleared his throat. About the rangers, I mean. I could scarcely believe it when I saw them in action during my first month running patrols with the army. My company's best rangers could traverse a muddy farmer's field just as quickly as we could ride our horses on the road beside it. Actually, shouldn't you have seen something similar with your escort on the promotional examination? No, I didn't pay attention to any of that. I was paranoid about a goblin jumping out from behind a rock and slitting my throat. It's more likely that they'd put an arrow in you. Even a wizard can kill the average goblin with a good whack, and the goblins know it. Dimaya gave Rangobart a good whack. Ow! Why do you have to be like that? Dimaya fumed. Like what? I was scared. Who cares about being rational when they're scared? Everyone can fly, right? Ludmilla asked again. Frian floated slowly into the air after casting her spell. Ludmilla eyed her curiously. How does carrying a child interact with flight magic? She asked. It factors in as additional encumbrance, Frian answered, so I fly as if I'm carrying a good-sized book around. What happens if you cast a fly spell on the baby? Please don't propose unsettling ideas like that. They flew low over the freshly tilled ground, following Ludmilla, who ran ahead of them. The uneven, muddy soil that should have probably sucked her boots off of her feet didn't seem to affect her mobility at all. You are a ranger? Frian asked. House Saradnik is a line of rangers, haven't I mentioned that before? I think so. I suppose I'm used to martial nobles being cavalrymen. She soon spotted a team of Death Knights ploughing a field on the terrace above theirs. Ludmilla stopped at the windbreak beside the field, where a pair of farmers were having lunch on the grass. They didn't stand upon Ludmilla's arrival, instead offering friendly nods in greeting. Afternoon, milady, one of them said. Good afternoon, Ludmilla replied. What's for lunch? Crab salad with crab rolls and a crab sandwich. I suppose I should be thankful that they haven't figured out a crab dish that goes with the fruit. Maybe I should have the restaurants change things up a bit, Ludmilla said. I know I instructed them to use crab with the meals, but I never thought they would go to such extremes. Well, I heard someone say that crab's a luxury, so I figure I shouldn't complain. Especially not in the chef's face. Who's that you got with you? Some acquaintances from the Empire. They wanted to see how things worked here. Work, eh? Now I am feeling all guilty. Indeed, the farmers hardly looked like they were hard at work. While they ate, the team of Death Knights made their way up and down the field with their plows. What's left for you to do with the undead working out there? Rangobart asked. When we're plowing? Not much. We have teams of Death Knights plowing the fields. Teams of skeletons and bone vultures pick through the fields for stones and other unwanted debris. We give everything a once-over before sowing the crops, Well, we use some new and improved seed drills that the Death Knights also handle. After that, the real work begins. How do the undead compare to conventional methods? It's hard to even compare. A village doing things the old-fashioned way shares teams of draft animals, taking turns with their tenancies. Here, our draft animals are the local security, so we can whistle up as many teams of Death Knights as we have plows. They can handle plows with 6 blades, too. The smiths are working on a 12-blade plow that we can use with solitas next spring. Anyway, the undead go faster, they don't have to rest every few hours like a team of horses does. They don't need to eat and there's no stables to muck out. They can work all day and night so things plowing gets done quick. Compared to the old days, yeah, no one in their right mind would want that after doing things the way we are now. Growing season's shorter up here than in the lowlands, too, so the speed's appreciated. Improvements in efficiency all around, then. Listening to the farmer pointed out a few small things that hadn't registered before. Clara and Leanne focused on the many applications of undead labor, but what happened when they weren't working was an important factor, too. While the need wasn't as severe as in Riestais, having a constant security presence was useful since army patrols couldn't be everywhere at once. Even if they were shared between the entire village, draft animals still needed to be fed and cared for even when they weren't being put to work. Colin and Wagner don't seem to push skeleton labor for agricultural applications, Frian said. Why is that? The demand for skeleton labor is much higher, Ludmilla replied. We are facing a shortage even within the Sorceress Kingdom. They appear to be plentiful in your domain. The benefits of early adoption, I suppose. Will there be a similar shortage of Death Series servitors and solitas in the future? Rangobart asked. That remains to be seen, Ludmilla answered. If the entire empire suddenly decided to lease our undead as a result of the trade talks, there might be short-term supply issues. Might be? That implied that the Sorceress Kingdom had thousands of Death Knights and Soul Eaters to casually lease out to random farmers. Was their raw power practically limitless? So you say that your real work begins after sowing, Rangobart said. Is that the usual maintenance of the fields? I think we call it managing secondary crops here. Can't rightly call them weeds anymore if we can sell them. We let them grow along with the crops, but they grow faster so we harvest them all season. Won't allowing the, former weeds to grow negatively affect the main crop? That's what we figured at first. Turned out that it didn't. Something to do with the magic that they cast on the fields. Plant growth? Frian asked. Yes, Ludmilla answered. Is it employed in the Empire? Rarely, Frian replied. There aren't many earth priests capable of casting it. The compensation scheme that they use is also, well, rather than charge mana rates, they demand 10% of the harvest, which comes out to far more than it would at standard mana rates. Does anyone take them up on the offer? Oh, yes. People fight over the opportunity, but the fact remains that there are very few priests capable of casting third-tier magic. The temples take advantage of the demand to make it a major affair to promote the faith of the Four. Who provides the service here? Druids do, Ludmilla said. Frian recalled the lizardman druids performing the ritual in the harbour village. If knowledge of rituals was widespread, all it took was a single druid with the plant growth spell and enough volunteers to provide the mana to enchant every acre of agricultural land. Out of curiosity, is that a service that can be provided to the Empire? I don't recall it being present at the exposition in Corlin Harbour. Considering that the spell would come from a druid, no. Enchanting the entire Empire with plant growth would be catastrophic for the natural balance. But they did it for you, Dimir said. The one who originally enchanted my fields doesn't anymore. That task is now the responsibility of the local druids, who do so because I am a ranger. Do druids and rangers belong to some exclusive club? How much do you pay for membership? There is an intrinsic understanding that rangers and druids act as nature's custodians. There are notable exceptions, of course. Like rangers in the Imperial Army, Rangobart said. It depends on the situation. Imperial patrols do utilize rangers in a manner that isn't out of line with their calling. It is when they are ordered to act in ways that disturb that natural balance that they become a problem. Of course, rangers and druids are people, too, so those acts may forever paint them as traitors in the minds of other rangers and druids. Do you believe that the rangers in the Imperial Army are traitors for their recent campaigns? I believe that they are in an unfortunate position, one that can hopefully be corrected over time. Anyways, you may submit a request to the Royal Court of the Sorceress Kingdom about the use of various magics, but it's not anything that I have control over. You could use your super-secret Ranger Club powers, Dimir said. Ludmilla gave Dimir a reproachful look. The Empire may believe this to be a quaint relationship or perhaps a minor annoyance, Ludmilla said, but I suspect that it will learn how serious it can be as it steps out into the world. Is there anything else you'd like to ask about our farms while you're here? Yes, Rangobart said. I believe we didn't fully explore the utilization of the undead. How is the harvest conducted? Do you use another type of machine to quickly reap everything? Not unless someone comes up with a new contraption, the first farmer said. We equip the undead with scythes and have them go at it. The Death Knights make a mess of things, though, so we stick to skeletons. Sheathing the windrows is still done by human hands, though, it's too complex for the skeletons for some reason. After the stalks dry, they go into a wagon and one of the soul eaters brings everything back to the village warehouses. Oh, are you going to show them the other thing, Lady Zaradnik? Is everything already set up? Yeah, the necromancers said so. The necromancers? What did necromancers have to do with agriculture? It felt like a stupid question given that they were farming with the undead, but she couldn't shake off the notion that something sinister might be afoot. Ludmilla thanked the two farmers before they returned to their carriage on the road. Freyan eyed the empty fields on either side as they made their way back to the fortified farming village. I understand that the undead are being used to simplify many aspects of the agricultural industry here, Freyan said, but it still feels like there are far too few farmers. It should feel that way to you since you're accustomed to nearly every household in a farming village being a farmer's household, Ludmilla replied. In these farming villages, however, there are only 20 farmer households. But doesn't that mean each agricultural tenancy is roughly 100 hectares? Once copses and common land are accounted for, yes. That's too much. It was over 10 times what the average farming household held in the Empire. Freyan sat mute as she struggled to extrapolate all of the implications. That explains why your villages are more like towns in character, Rangobart said. In certain ways, yes, Ludmilla nodded. My circumstances allowed me to structure everything according to the new realities that came with undead labor. The population of each of these farming villages is effectively urban and mostly works in what human societies in the region would recognize as urban industries. This has brought with it several unprecedented boons. Such as? Probably the most important among them is that the classical divide between rural and urban society doesn't exist in Warden's Vale. Everyone is an urbanite and those in traditionally rural vocations live in urban centers. That's. Rangobart frowned and fell silent. Freyan's already overtaxed mind fell into chaos from the unexpected attack. It was truly as unprecedented as Ludmilla said. The divide between rural and urban society was a core reality of human civilization. One was either a member of the rural elite and thus also a component of the aristocratic establishment, or they were an urbanite. The Empire did not care to address this divide. One could say that the imperial administration was a manifestation of urban society that exerted control over rural society. Turning the entire population into urbanites was not only considered impossible, but an entirely alien concept. Now that Freyan was aware of it, however, she immediately understood its ramifications for governance. The foundation for a unified urban culture was being laid in Warden's Vale, and its tiny population made it easy for Ludmilla to shape it as she saw fit. It was something that the Empire couldn't achieve even in its wildest dreams because the window of opportunity to do so only existed at a very early stage of development where it should have also been impossible. I'm beginning to understand why Lian says that you're a cheater, Freyan said. It is what it is, Ludmilla smiled slightly. I saw little reason to imitate lands developed under an obsolete paradigm and absolutely no reason to adopt the systems that create all of their problems. But you must surely have some problems of your own. Of course, Ludmilla replied. But they're good problems to have. We are investing our resources to answer questions posed by the future rather than spending them fixing the mistakes of the past. No other territory in the Duchy of Eranthal is in my position, but many territories in the Empire are, and many more will be. It was a pointed remark that required no effort to interpret. Both she and Rangobart had just been granted fiefs in the wilderness. Thousands of imperial knights had similarly been granted land, as well. With even more imperial expansion slated in the decades to come, those thousands would become tens or even hundreds of thousands. So your objective is to influence the Empire's new developments rather than the existing ones? Simply put, yes, Ludmilla replied. The Empire is set on a course for expansion and they will succeed so long as they pick their fights carefully. With General Ray now in command of the 6th Army Group, the Empire will soon find itself in a golden age fueled by its new territorial acquisitions. With this in mind, I would like to see that success take a more healthy form, from a cosmopolitan standpoint. Considering that the Empire already considers itself the pinnacle of cosmopolitan society, Freyan said, you may have some trouble convincing them. It's still more effective than standing on a box in our winter and trying to convince the citizens to change their ways. I don't expect anyone to copy what I'm doing here, it's impossible to do so. What I'd like to see is the principles employed in my territory being adapted to fit the unique properties and situation of any given fief. I suspect that most of the resistance to this will come from the imperial administration rather than the frontier folk. I think I can see why you would say that, Freyan said, but how would you define the problem? I do not know if there is any formal terminology for it, Ludmilla said, but the two major factors are distance and control. I think you understand the control issue well enough. What I mean by distance is not physical distance, but the degrees of separation that any individual has from any given process. If one has too many degrees of separation from a process, one loses touch with the realities of that process unless one makes an active effort to understand it. Not many people care enough to do so or have the time to, even if they did. Of course, Freyan nodded. That is why regulatory bodies such as the guilds exist. They ensure that the general public has access to products and services that meet acceptable quality standards. But what defines those standards? I can guarantee you that the guilds in the Empire do not care how many goblins are killed or displaced to procure their lumber shipments. The Imperial administration is even worse because they consider security an investment and the lumber as a return that the Empire is entitled to. Tenants who receive the right to harvest lumber treat it as such, and their landlords see it as a source of revenue that they deserve because their taxes pay for infrastructure and fund the Imperial Army. In every single case, no consideration is made to what exists outside of the imperial economy. At best, a forest is simply a prize to be won from its inhabitants and exploited for the benefit of the empire while it is being converted into farmland. The gods forbid that the inhabitants resist or retaliate. That only somehow proves that the empire is on the side of justice, and now all manner of assassins and armies can be dispatched to deal with the problem. Assassins? I believe you call them adventurers and workers. At any rate, the problem I foresee is that the imperial administration will impose imperial standards on its newly acquired territory as much as it has in the past. Am I correct in assuming this? That should be the case, Rangobart said. Once my land has been surveyed, the imperial administration will make an assessment and issue recommendations to my seneschal about how to make the land as productive as possible for the empire. Right. What if Brennanville is as inhospitable for human habitation as it sounds? Then I will have some choice words for the court council. In all seriousness, I assume that some effort will be made to tame the land. And thus the empire remains forever mundane, Ludmilla sighed. I lost you, Rangobart said. Their carriage stopped at the outskirts of the village, which consisted of the common land around the walls. A few villagers could be seen here and there, tending to their livestock. What do you think the yield of the fields that we just visited is? Of the principal crop. What do you grow here? Freyan asked. The latest harvest was oats. If it's oats and you're using plant growth to enchant the fields, it should be just under 75 bushels a hectare. It was a frightening amount, especially considering that each of Ludmilla's farmers managed 100 hectares of land. Oats were a popular crop in cool, wet regions and produced 2 harvests a year. That meant a single farming household in Warden's Vale produced enough food to feed 1,100 adult humans for an entire year after seed stores were set aside. And this single village is exporting enough food to feed 22,000 people. These farmers must be ludicrously rich. That was the same thing that our central administration's almanac listed. The actual harvest was 100 bushels per hectare. Huh? But plant growth already guarantees 150% of the maximum yield of any plant under its influence. You would make a good elder lich, Ludmilla smirked. They said the same thing, then checked the numbers and remeasured the harvest 10 times over. The result was the same, however. Since that was the case, they tried to destroy the erroneous harvest since it was clearly in violation of the mandated amount. I had to get the Sorcerer King to stop them. I thought elder liches are supposed to be smart, Dimir said. That may be so, but they're also very arbitrary in the way that undead can be. And here I thought that the ones working with the second army group were just admirably austere, Rangobart muttered. Freyan eyed one of the chickens blithely pecking away in the field nearby. Did it lay bigger than average eggs? So you attribute this to the effect of primal energies proposed in the unified mana theory that Miss Linnes brought up, Freyan said. The abundant positive energy present in Warden's Vale results in higher yields. Higher maximum yields. We assume that plant growth still applies because yields are still uniform. The difference created by the spell made it much easier to notice. Also, this phenomenon and many others like it in Warden's Vale led to the creation of a unified mana theory, and its effects are being researched all over my territory. So you propose that we leave our territories relatively untouched to take advantage of these effects? That is your decision to make, but justifying it to the Empire will be difficult in most scenarios. Why is that? Clara once told me that the only way to keep a tree from being harvested is to convince those who would harvest it that it is more valuable to them if it is left standing, Ludmilla said. This is nearly impossible when there is always someone out there who prioritizes personal material gains, and the Imperial administration champions that way of thinking. Leaving a regular forest standing in the Empire is not as valuable to the Empire as the agricultural development that it stands in the way of. Harvesting that forest for valuable materials is merely a bonus obtained along the way. Freyan's gaze went out to the fields being prepared for sowing. Assuming your theories lead somewhere, she said, I would say that the results achieved by your agricultural efforts would be quite convincing. The effects of elemental gradients are subtle, Ludmilla told her. What you see here would be considered extreme, just as extreme as undead manifesting in the Katsa Plains. Life generates positive energy, just as death generates negative energy. Normally, the balance between the two swings back and forth, but only slightly. Warden's Vale is a crucible because the regular balance doesn't exist here. Negative energy is being siphoned away, causing the positive energy that it usually cancels out to overflow. That's an interesting hypothesis, Freyan said. Could it be that the Katsa Plains and Warden's Vale form two poles of an elemental conflux? You are welcome to contribute to our research if you wish, Ludmilla said. Just don't fireball Master Linnes if you lose your temper. That aside, it wouldn't help any case for conservation of elemental gradients in the Empire because there is no known way to replicate the effects of what is going on in Warden's Vale, though I suppose that humans are quite good at replicating the effects of the Katsa Plains. We are? Consider graveyards through the lens of unified mana theory. Collecting death in one place has the effect of engineering an artificial negative energy gradient, just as leaving some elemental ice lying around creates a tangible ice gradient in that alchemical workshop. Reastais and the Empire chose to fight every year in the Katsa Plains, effectively dumping the resulting negative energy in a convenient place. If I recall correctly, there were rumors that the Katsa Plains has grown over the past few years. Those rumors are true, Freyan shuddered. The northern fringes of the Katsa Plains have advanced by a few meters over the past few years. Some of the researchers at the Imperial Ministry of Magic postulate that the growth will stop now that the annual skirmishes have stopped. So it appears that the Ministry of Magic does have some sense of what we've been researching here. A sigh escaped Freyan's lips. She was so sure that she had everything sorted out before coming to the Sorcerer's Kingdom. With lunch long over, they returned to a much livelier village. As Rangobart had noted, it more resembled an urban center than a farming community. Most of the population worked in the settlement's workshops rather than out in the fields, and most of the industries present couldn't usually be found in a rural village. It's harder to tell what's missing from a regular town than what's out of place in a regular village, Freyan said. I don't see any ends, Dimir said. Transportation around my territory is fast enough that all guest accommodations are in the harbour village, Ludmilla told them. Not that we have an inn there. I'd say that our current accommodations are superior to anything short of the most luxurious of inns, Rangobart said. Even then, we get far more space. Do you receive many visitors? We don't, Ludmilla said. Despite all that's changed in recent times, this is still very much the frontier. Even if the usual dangers no longer exist, it's still an uninteresting place to most. We export a few resources and import specialized tools that can't be produced here yet. Our exports are spoken for by commodity contracts, so visiting merchants are rare. Aside from that, we get the occasional migrant. Frian looked around the village square, gauging the expressions of the residents. There was no hint of uncertainty, fear, or deprivation. For the most part, they looked rather content with their lives. I find it difficult to believe that you'd have difficulty attracting migrants, Frian said. The quality of life here seems to be peerless, at least as far as what commoners have access to goes. Does the Empire not have difficulties encouraging migrants to their frontiers? Ludmilla asked. Our domestic ministries are responsible for ensuring that the frontier has enough settlers, Frian answered. It's a matter of necessity since most of the landlords are Imperial Knights and they hardly have the time to recruit people. There are dozens of initiatives running at any given time encouraging the citizens to take advantage of new opportunities. I see. We don't have anything like that here. Nearly all of our immigration has been made possible by the assistance of the Temple of the Six in Rantel. Not that I'm complaining. There are many advantages to having a small population that shares common values, especially in a place where cooperation is so important. The same can be said for Miss Grant's efforts. She's running things according to her imperial education with imperial settlers. She stared blankly across the square as the latter statement slowly sunk in. Was that the true reason why Nemel had ended up in the Sorceress Kingdom? Ludmilla had a vested interest in how the Empire intended to approach its expansion into the frontier. Now, she had a student of the Imperial Magic Academy running a settlement in her frontier territory who would provide insight into the Empire's approaches to development. It was difficult to believe that the sequence of events wasn't planned. They stopped for lunch at the village's restaurant, enjoying their meal on a sun-warmed patio as they watched the activity around the square. Many undead could be seen assisting with various menial tasks, from transporting goods as she had seen before to powering machinery. It seems like everyone has a skeleton of their own, Frian said. Every human household in Warden's Vale has a skeleton, yes, Ludmilla said. The workshops usually have several. I thought it would be a good way to accustom the people to the use of undead labor. Was it? I would consider it a success. Unfortunately, the demand for skeletons is too high these days to implement this idea anywhere else. They probably wouldn't be well received in the Empire anyway, Dimir said. The temples would gain a hefty amount of support from all of the people thinking that the undead will take their jobs. That would be quite the headache, Rangobart agreed. I can see why Lady Zaradnik chooses to focus on the Empire's frontier expansion rather than its developed territories. The nobles may be able to get away with replacing draft animals with the undead, but civil unrest would undoubtedly rise if people realized that the undead were stealing their livelihoods. It's better to keep them from trying to migrate than displacing them through impoverishment. If we halve the demand for labor on the frontier by utilizing the undead, it should reduce the burdens on the imperial administration, as well. But that approach isn't without its problems, Frian noted. The costs for undead labor are so low that any new frontier territory that employs it will have a distribution of wealth that's entirely different from the rest of the Empire. Not only will you be facing opposition from the temples, but you will also be facing opposition from the current establishment. That includes the imperial administration. It will not tolerate the existence of a new class of ultra-wealthy frontier lords who also happen to form the bulk of its military power. Rangobart sent a pointed look in Ludmilla's direction. She was the very image of what might eventually manifest in the Empire. In fact, one could say that she was the ideal that the Empire attempted to portray in its propaganda. The Empire knew that this ideal was impossible in the past, but, once they realized that it was achievable, the Imperial administration would take measures to prevent the possibility of it ever coming to pass. Unlike the Sorceress Kingdom, they couldn't afford to allow the rise of a powerful faction of new warrior elites in the political arena. How would the Imperial administration even stop it? Rangobart asked. If newly landed Imperial Knights choose to employ undead labor, it isn't as if the Empire can outlaw the practice in retaliation. I also doubt that the Emperor will levy special taxes against them as he does with civilian aristocrats who oppose his reforms. Frian considered his question for a moment. If one looked at things from a different angle, the Imperial administration could make the very problem that Rangobart presented work to its advantage. The Imperial administration will employ existing systems, in particular the way that they've restructured and redistributed land seized from the attainted. Broadly speaking, the fief of a second-class Imperial Knight is currently rated at 50 hides, basically a village's worth of land. What will probably happen is that they will use the latest round of awards to assess the value of land if one employs undead labor, so titles granted from now on will be smaller. If the undead halve the labor requirements of an agricultural development, second-class Imperial Knights will receive 25 hides worth by current standards instead of 50. I can't say what the final calculation will be, but that's the gist of it. Taxes will see adjustments across the board to equalize revenues across the Empire. And the Empire would be able to support twice as many Imperial Knights. Rangobart rubbed his jaw, giving them that much more military might to expand with. How much of a reduction in labor costs do the undead amount to, Lady Zaradnik? It depends on the industry, Lady Zaradnik said. Technology is a factor, as well, since machines can transform raw power into specific types of work. How many hectares are there to a hide in the Empire? The average hide is 8 hectares, Frian told her, making the current average fief of an Imperial Knight 400 hectares. It's basically one village per Imperial Knight. So this village we're in manages 5 Imperial Knight titles worth of land. Well, their villages wouldn't be the same as, oh, I see what you mean. If we use undead labor, our villages may end up looking like this one instead. Not only will our calculations have to account for revenues from agriculture and forestry, but also the industries that we'd normally find in a town. This complicates things greatly. No, if the Empire administers new urban centers directly, then this change is unprecedented. Our current economic models are practically useless in the face of it. Thinking further on things, they already knew that a single farming tenancy in Warden's Vale was 100 hectares of land. That meant the undead were reducing agricultural labor requirements by over 90%. The village they were dining in could support at least 10 second-class Imperial Knights if one went by land area alone. Never mind doubling the manpower of the Imperial Army, they could increase it tenfold. The coffers of the Empire would be filled to bursting through the direct administration of the thousands of new urban centers that were created with their conquest of new frontiers. Perhaps achieving similar levels of education, urbanization, and industrialization as Warden's Vale wasn't as impossible as it initially seemed. I must admit that the possibilities are exciting, Frian said, but the Imperial administration will have to be very careful about how to proceed. They're sure to regret promoting so many Imperial Knights before being made aware of what you're doing here. What would they have done instead? Ludmilla asked. Develop the territories before handing out the titles, Frian answered. A village like this, for example, could be split between 10 second-class Imperial Knights. Only half of the administrative staff would be required to manage the village and its land, and the direct administration of the village would provide the Empire with lucrative urban revenues. The Empire could master plan entire regions before distributing its lands. Ludmilla sighed. Well, that just went in an undesirable direction. Was there something wrong with what I said? Frian answered. If the Empire master plans development, it most likely means that they will try to turn every square meter of new territory into farmland. It has every incentive to do so since it will increase its economic and military might, which will, in turn, allow it to expand even more. Countless people will be killed or displaced at the cold stroke of a pen in the distant Imperial center. I suppose Nonna was right in her assertion. Nonna? The elder lich that you saw in the office at my manor. She once told me that the bureaucracy must expand to meet the needs of the expanding bureaucracy. By all appearances, the Empire appears to do just that. What did you have to say about that? I asked if she was trying to crack a joke. Bureaucratic procedure is no replacement for leadership and vision. A bureaucracy that exists to serve itself should have been purged long before it reached that point. Any country that exists in that state is essentially ruled by a faceless monstrosity that is only accountable to itself. My family says that from time to time, Rangobart said. They are not wrong, Ludmilla shrugged. Once they settled their meals, they continued their tour of the village. Dimia looked over her shoulder at the now empty restaurant. That place seems way too big for this village, she said. The food was super cheap for the quality, too. Do they get enough business? It's large enough to feed the village, Ludmilla replied. Huh? Cooks do the cooking in Warden's Vale, Ludmilla told her. That restaurant serves breakfast, lunch, and dinner to the entire village. That's why it seems so large to you. Isn't it cheaper for the people to make their own meals? No. Cooking for many is more efficient and cost-effective than a household cooking for itself. My people eat better food and have better things to do with their time. Even the farmers? Even the farmers. Ludmilla led them across the village square and back into the light tower. They went to stand on the metal elevator at the base of the tower, which had conveyed them to the top earlier that same morning. This time, however, it unexpectedly lowered them into a deep shaft. Frianne grew a bit claustrophobic as the light from above slowly faded into the distance. Is this a mining village as well as a farming village? She asked. No, Ludmilla answered. My territory's stone quarry starts 100 meters below this village. I was entertaining the idea of using it as an additional warehouse, but the Sorcerer King once mentioned to me that indoor farming is possible with a bit of innovation. The elevator clanked to a stop in a cavernous chamber roughly 3 meters high. Between the rows of pillars supporting the ceiling were plots of soil framed by raised stone beds. Magical lighting hung from the ceiling at regular intervals, turning the space as bright as day. The sight stretched into the distance, creating a somewhat dizzying experience. A hooded figure separated from a group taking notes nearby, her black robe sweeping ominously over the stone as she slowly approached. Dimir clutched at Frianne's sleeve with an apprehensive expression. Is that a necromancer? She asked. Yes, Ludmilla answered. This is Isabella Aguado, a member of the Faculty of Necromancy. She still had no idea what necromancers had to do with farming. Were they growing some sinister plant related to death underground? Frianne and Dimir shifted back a half step as the blood-red lips visible in the shadows of the necromancer's cowl stirred. Hi, the necromancer said. Someone mentioned that the installation for the facility was complete, Ludmilla said. The installation for this section of this facility is complete, my lady, Isabella replied. The farmers damn near stepped all over us the moment they heard that it was ready. I don't recall ever being so enthusiastic about sowing crops back when I was on the farm. I hope they're logging their progress properly. Oh, the elder liches will make sure of that, Isabella grumbled. They nearly trampled us too on their way to collect data. I see. This is Frianne, Dimir, and Rangobart. They're guests from the Empire that I've been showing around. Isabella's cowl bobbed in greeting at each of them in turn, then stopped at Rangobart. Are you seeing anyone? Isabella asked. Rangobart blinked silently at the question, then took a step back. The necromancer advanced. If you don't mind, Ludmilla said, could you show them around the place and explain what's going on here? Isabella pulled back her cowl, revealing a youthful, attractive face that didn't in any way suggest that she was a practitioner of the dark arts. Then, she latched onto Rangobart's arm and led him down the aisle with a pleasant smile. This state-of-the-art facility is a collaboration between the local farmers, masons, carpenters, and arcane artisans, Isabella said. Experiments over the winter have proven that it's possible to grow various crops indoors, and now we're scaling up our trials. You mean to say that you used magical lighting in conjunction with temperature control items to grow food indoors, Rangobart said. Much as one would grow plants in a solarium? I don't think that's an adequate comparison. You're sort of right about what's happening, but you're wrong at the same time. It's more like we're growing stuff in a mineshaft with some magical lighting. That's not to say what we're doing here isn't revolutionary, though. Simplicity is strength, so to speak. We don't have to worry about the weather and it stays warm enough down here even in the middle of winter. With widespread adoption, we may be able to match subterranean civilizations. Subterranean civilizations? Yeah, like the mountain dwarves. We humans think we're doing great with 8 or 9 million in a country, but a major subterranean civilization might have billions. Maybe trillions if they're insectoids or something along those lines. Anyways, yeah, we grow food down here. Look at the potatoes, aren't they great? They stopped to look at a plot of dirt. I don't see any potatoes, Dimir adjusted her spectacles. It says potatoes right there, the necromancer pointed at a sign at the front of the plot. We should pick something that has had time to sprout, Ludmilla said. Fine. They followed Isabella as she led Rangobart away, walking past several dozen plots with potato signs before stopping again. Dozens of green sprouts suck out of the dirt before them, planted in rows along a set of trellises. Let's see. Isabella leaned forward to read the sign for the plot. These ones are peas. Do you really work here? Frian asked. I do. Isabella replied, but members of the faculty are responsible for setting up the magic items, not planting stuff. Oh. I suppose that makes sense. You suppose? What did you think I was doing down here? Growing zombies? I can already tell you that it doesn't work. How do you know that? Rangobart asked. Isabella squeezed herself against Rangobart's arm. Oh, you're interested? She answered coyly. Well, it primarily has to do with the concentrations of negative energy in the area. Or, rather, there doesn't seem to be any at all, but we don't know why. I've heard this mentioned before, Rangobart said, but how does one measure concentrations of negative energy? There are many observable indicators. As far as I know, all humans react to the presence of negative energy when it gets above a certain threshold. Most relate it to an unsettling feeling similar to walking into an old cemetery, or maybe that has always been the feeling and we make that association because that's what we know. There's also the smell of death akin to untended mausoleums and old tombs. Once that threshold is crossed, you get the usual hauntings and possessions and such. And before that? It's more subtle, Isabella replied. Certain plants or variants of plants start growing. Other vegetation exhibits what we call negative energy entanglement, what are popularly known as spooky characteristics. Corpses linger and signs of violent death like bloodstains and damage to the surroundings seem to enhance the character of a place. But that just sounds like how bards try to describe undead-infested places, Dimir said. No, that's just how undead-infested places actually are, Isabella said. It's not something that requires embellishment. Anyway, last autumn, we went to investigate the operations area in the upper reaches where Lady Zaradnik massacred over 100,000 people. We figured there'd have to be something to work with there, but there wasn't anything at all. It would have been devastatingly disappointing if the phenomenon itself wasn't so damn interesting. Frian wasn't sure she wanted to know what would happen if the necromancer had found something to work with. Oh, speaking of which, Lady Zaradnik. Chandler heard from some adventurers picking up supplies in the harbor that they found a big fat negative energy zone on the other side of the ancient pass. Do you know anything about it? I've known about it since that goblin army invaded the upper reaches, Ludmilla replied. What? Why didn't you tell us? Because it was an ideal location for a training expedition. I didn't want any overeager necromancers trying to sneak in some research or give the adventurers foreknowledge of the area by issuing side quests tch. But they're still going to bring the faculty of necromancy in as civilian analysts, right? They're not going to do something dumb like have the temples mess the place up, right? The necromancer's increasingly feverish pitch caused Frian to eye her nervously. Annoyingly, Rangobart seemed either uncaring or oblivious to the danger. The temples of the Four still don't want to have anything to do with us, so it will just be the faculty of necromancy and some adherents of Sursana. Still, don't go over there unless you're called for. Wahoo! Isabella beamed. I never realized that the expedition was so close, Rangobart said. When you mentioned that they were in the Abelian wilderness, I figured they were far from the borders of the Sorceress Kingdom. I did say that I should see about familiarizing you with their work, Ludmilla said. We'll be visiting the expedition area in the days to come. Your consideration is greatly appreciated, my lady. So, Frian turned her attention back to the rows of pea sprouts. You mentioned that there were experiments carried out over the winter related to this underground farm. How will the yields here compare to conventional farming? That's what we're trying to find out with these first few harvests, Isabella said. Well, at least the farmers are. We arcane artisans, on the other hand, are working on a device that will change the world of magic items forever. Is that so? Rangobart looked down at the necromancer on his arm. What might that be, Miss Aguado? Isabella looked up through her long lashes at Rangobart, a blush coloring her cheeks. That's, a switch, maybe? Or something like that. Do you know how many magical lights are down here? It takes an hour to turn them all on, then another to turn them all off. And that's just for this one section. Imagine when we've covered the same amount of land as the fields above. Anyway, I should get back to work. I'll message you later this evening. With that, the necromancer fled to the lift and disappeared up the shaft. Ludmilla released a small sigh. One of my necromancers developed a case of stupid, she said. Stupid Rangobat, Dimmer Ear grumbled. Making other people stupid. Is what she said true? Frian asked. You plan on making this underground farming operation just as extensive as the fields above? That depends on the results of our experimentation here, Ludmilla answered. The farmers say that it's more complicated than growing crops in regular conditions, plus we have several other systems undergoing testing as well. I suppose Isabella got too distracted to explain much. What else are you doing down here? It's not so much that we're doing something entirely separate as we are tying several things together. Since these chambers are tunneled into the bedrock, we must devise a working water management system. There's also Sophie Neuer's slime concept that we want to put to the test. You mean the slime finery? That's right, Ludmilla nodded. We've been keeping slimes in the sewers here, but we've just left them alone to do their thing so far. The first thing we need to do is find a slime rancher, but the one ranger we have who has tamed any slimes so far wants to join the Royal Army. Freyan recalled their visits with the monster researcher during the winter. She was honestly surprised that Ludmilla fully intended to try out her idea. How long until you believe you'll have some conclusive results on your experiments here? There are solariums and such in the Empire, but no one has ever tried to conduct indoor agriculture at this scale before. As simple as it may seem on a conceptual level, the truth is that succeeding here will drastically alter food production in the region. You'll be doubling your agricultural output and adding a third growing season besides. Even if they succeed, Ludmilla said, it will take a long time to produce the magic items required to equip the entire facility. Also, I believe that nearly all of the candidate crops for this underground farm are vegetables and fruits rather than staple crops. That still means you'll be the region's sole provider of fresh fruits and vegetables during the winter, Freyan noted. I understand that you don't put the same importance on exports here as others might, but there would be many people who would appreciate the produce. Clara and the others mentioned as much, Ludmilla said. I'm not averse to the idea, but how these new farms affect the region's balance is still my primary concern. Also, it should provide some much-needed experience for my farming tenants. Your farming tenants? Freyan furrowed her brow. They seem capable enough of growing crops as it is. Not that I've ever heard it to be a difficult task. There are certainly important nuances to growing even the most common crops, Ludmilla said. That's not why they need the experience, however. We can have that discussion when we head south tomorrow.